In this module, we'll be looking at architecture over time. One thing to note before looking at the architecture itself is that history is not simply the repository of unchanging facts, but a process, a pattern of living, and changing attitudes and interpretations. So what does that mean? That means that architecture and history are one thing that you study, and it is not a static discipline, right? So history is ever changing and it is never static, and it's always up to the interpretation as the historian to look at architecture in the past. So let's start with the Egyptian pyramids around 2500 BC. And these show quite a lot about the Egyptians. It shows really quite a civilized society that was capable of such stunning and large architecture even for modern times, with the highest pyramid standing at 137 meters tall today. Next, we have the Agora in Greece, and this was a communal setting, and the architecture allowed for societal traits of trade and commerce. So we see here how architecture is built for the benefit of society. To introduce a little bit of theory behind classical architecture, let's look at some Greek orders. So starting from the left, we have the Doric, which originated in 7th century BC, the Ionic in 6th century BC, and the Corinthian in 4th century BC. And as you can see, these orders get more and more elaborate through the centuries as the sculptures began to experiment more with elaboration and ornamentation within the structural elements of the architecture. It's a representation of a changing society. And one example of Doric order is the Pantheon in Athens. And then we have the Romans, and the Romans came up with arch. And what the arch allowed the Romans to do was build taller architecture with fewer materials. So here is a Roman aqueduct, post-Dugard, built in the 1st century AD, and it shows the usefulness of arches. And the load from above is transferred down into the vertical supports of the arches, allowing for strength without using excess material. And so they took not only this example of arches, but the Romans took it to the freestanding dome of the Pantheon in Rome. And so these freestanding domes worked in similar ways, and then, well, it distributes the weight over the edges, and then suddenly you have this massive interior space with large dome roofs, and it really opens up to a new type of architecture in that way. So here we can see that the architecture is constantly changing and adapting to the new technological advancements of society. Here we have an example of Romanesque architecture, and it is characterized by the same semicircular arches emerging out of Roman architecture. Some of you might notice that this is indeed the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Arches are built into the walls to add additional support to build higher and grander. Next is Gothic architecture, and it is perhaps one of the most famous medieval types of architecture. It's characterized by its pointed arches, rose windows, stained glass windows, and arch buttresses. Here we see a photo of Notre Dame in Paris, and you can see the massive rose window, the spires, the pointed arches, and buttresses quite clearly. On the interior, here is Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and this highlights really prominent stained glass windows and decorations, along with tall vaulted ceilings, also characteristic of Gothic architecture. What came after Gothic architecture was the Renaissance architecture, and Renaissance means rebirth and the readoption of classical art and sculpture. So this is St. Peter's Basilica, which is a well-known example of Renaissance architecture, having been built with the likes of figures such as Michelangelo, some of you might know. And so the use of classical order, mathematical proportions is typical of the Renaissance style of architecture. They take a lot of elements from classical architecture and bring them into, at the time, the modern architecture of rebirth. And this is an interior of St. Peter's Basilica. You can see the ornamentation, you can see the Corinthian columns embedded into the side walls, and the sort of elaboration of classical art and appreciation. Here is the Palace of Versailles. It is Baroque architecture, and it's all about ornamentation and embellishments from the Renaissance. So here is also the interior, and you can really see how ornamented with the chandeliers and gold leafing the whole palace is. The White House in America, in DC, is an example of neoclassical architecture designed by James Hobben in 1792. So it takes some elements from classical architecture and brings them to this more minimalist modern period. Moving a little bit further in history, we have the Art Nouveau and Art Deco, which are characterized by geometrical shapes. Here's an example of the Chrysler Building and its crown and spire, which are iconic period examples of Art Deco. So, history is ever-changing by the modern architect's interpretation. Novel ideas can only be thought of in comparison to what has come before. So that is to say, to plan, we must know what has gone on in the past and feel what is coming in the future.